I'm Alfred Guarisco. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my history, my family history in Baldwin County and myself. I was born Sunday, June the 2nd, 1929, in my family home. And my parents were Agostino Guarisco, who was an immigrant from Sicily, Italy. My mother was born in Bradeville, Illinois. Father was direct from Italy, and my grandparents were from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire at that time, and Franz Joseph was the person that signed the documents of his immigration. My mother's parents worked in the coal mine in Braidwood, and later joined the Italian colony in Daphne, which is a whole history in itself. My father came straight to Mobile from Italy and worked with the Southern Railroad at one time up at on the railroad called Nueva Palermo. That broke up and he moved down to Mobile. And he came across one Sunday afternoon on the bay boats to visit the Italian colony in Belfast, where he met my mother, and that's all how that occurred. I'm the last child of 10, and my one sister remains, Angel Guarisco Tryon. She married Leonard D. Tryon. I myself married Joan St. and we have 5 children of our own. They are all very successful, and we're very, very proud of them. I went to school at the courthouse in Daphne, which had been vacated because, as history says, Baymanet stole the courthouse. But the building remained, and the state of Alabama opened it as a junior college, which primarily was for teaching teachers. They called them normal schools. My teacher was Mrs. Jewell, and that building was very good. It was as modern for the times as could be. There was no school in Daphne at the time. So the next year, I believe I was in the jail. The jail portion of the courthouse had been converted to a classroom, and that's where I went to school the second year. Third year, I went across the street into a residence, and then fourth year, they moved us to the Woodman of the World building, where I went to school there about 3 years. There was no playground equipment to speak of, and what there was, the big kids had that. Anyway, we made our own games. Mostly it was chasing, fox and dogs, and that sort of thing. Stealing sticks was another favorite. The years at the Woodman of the World was interesting in that we had outdoor privies, one for the boys and one for the girls. And the water was on the front porch, and it came from down the street where Mr. Gus Bertonale let us have water from his well. And the teacher taught us how to make cups out of folding paper. We, again, had no playground equipment, and we made our own games. Again, most of them were running games, and stealing sticks, again, was a favorite. When I became into the 6th grade, the state had built the finest school in the state, in Daphne, and it was totally modern. It had steam heat throughout. It had intercom systems, and kind of horrifying to us children. Man, they could be listening to us, you know. Anyway, it was a fine school, and Aubrey McVeigh was our principal at that time, a very fine person. And the building was just new, immaculate, and he warned us boys, don't do anything to just face this building, and said boys had a habit of standing up against the wall and propping your foot back. So there'll be none of that. Anyway, it turned out that that was a great school. It went to the 9th grade, and then we went to Fairhope High School from that. And I graduated from Fairhope High School in 1947. One of my favorite memories at Fairhope High School was a recess of playing volleyball. And volleyball was not played in a proper manner. We were just volleying back and forth, and the net was rather low. And we had a great time. And one incident, it was just, to me, it was hilarious. The ball was served straight across the net in a real steamer, and caught Etheridge Mancy unaware, hit him right in the middle of his head, and it bounced back over the net. Well, that broke things up. Just everybody started laughing and carrying on. It was really hilarious. Fond memories also was, again, there was a limited playground, and they allowed us to dance at a lunch hour, and we would go into the hall there, and we would dance to the 40s music, you know, 50. Now this was wartime, and upon graduation, or at the period of graduation, we had servicemen coming back from World War II that had been wounded and so forth. So we had servicemen graduating with us in a high school that had come back from the service and being drafted. And that also was very significant to us. And but there was only about 50 of us in the class at high school, which now I just can't imagine, but there's hundreds graduating. So anyway, it was a good school, and I enjoyed it. Living in Daphne has been a great experience, and it was such almost like a Mayberry community. People were very nice. We knew just about everybody in Daphne. We had Jubilee or so, they would always say, come on down and use my place. You can come down here and look for Jubilees anytime you like. And fishing on the various piers, crabbing was especially fun. It still is, for that matter. But we had a May Day celebration once a year, and that was a great event, especially on the years where we had elections, so that you would have all your politicians down there to speak to the people, and it made it a big event. Each community that had a group that wanted to submit a court would submit a court for May Day, and the object was to choose the May Queen. And it was a very well done event, and it was important to the Daphne at large, and most everybody had something they did in May Day. Now, my friend Bubba Hansen and I ran the snow cone booth for, it must have been 10 years. Anyway, that was our contribution to the May Day, and the other groups were cooking chicken, and it had athletic events, and at night they had a dance. So it was a very important thing, and just knew everybody, and we would get up to the Mancy's Beer Tavern and have a group meet there and just socialize. shoot the bull and find out what's going on in the world, and it was kind of a in and out place. There was also, Daphne was 1927, the city was incorporated. The same year the bay boats quit running, and that changed the complexion of Daphne completely, for it was oriented towards the bay, and everything was oriented toward the wharves. Well, when the bay boats quit running and the causeway to both opened up, the main street became the main center of Daphne. And the post office was moved up to Main Street, Daphne, as well as Trounds. And then Frank Mancy, at that time, about 1917, had a grocery store run by his daughter Elvira, and she married Angelo Tround. They had a big family, and they ran Tround's store from 1917 to 1987, I believe. I'd have to check that out. But it was the hub of Daphne. The post office went into the building, and they had the Greyhound bus stop, and they had one of the only telephones in Daphne, and they were most accommodating, and they would deliver messages to various people, and that did not have telephones, and that could not, and you could make a long distance call from them, and find out what your charges were and then pay them for it. But it was the hub of Daphne, and they were very instrumental in whatever was occurring in Daphne, supporting all the organizations and supporting the community in general. I have some fond memories of Christmas in Daphne. It was a very small community, and mainly being Catholic, I was usually in the choir for rehearsing for the Christmas Mass, which was midnight Mass, and we would have a big party afterwards. But as kids, we would get firecrackers and pester people, and one of them in particular was called a torpedo. And it was a little gadget that had rocks in it and powder, and you threw it real hard at the pavement and it would explode. And throwing them against the buildings, there was a man in Daphne that ran a store named Hill, and he hated those torpedoes. And he was from Missouri, and he had a real heavy Missouri twang, and he would slow talking, and he'd say, "You boys, quit throwing them Peters at my store." Anyway, it was something that kids are gonna do, and we did it. And so every year it was the same thing. But anyway, it was great, and the community was just so wide open to the spirit of Christmas, and wherever you went, it was just open, like Mayberry, I tell people that I was raised in a terrarium. We lived at the end of the street, more or less, and on a home, a very nice home, that was 400 feet back, and pecan trees were around it, and pine trees were around it, and I was sheltered from the streets of were learning street stuff. So I had a very sheltered life, and I never did learn to be street smart, and I still haven't. Daphne was very diversified. It was part farmer, part bay fisherman, part seaman. It had some entrepreneurs in it that were part of it. And we had a minimal of a black-white problem, in my opinion. People were really courteous and cared about each other. When I was a kid one time, we were working in the potato fields, and we were working on a stake. And there was a black woman there named Mary Macmillan that was really kind to us kids. She was out picking up potatoes with us, but she could tell when we were just wearing down, and she would help us with our row. We had a stake, and just people that we met and worked with like that, and it was opportunity because I was raised in the middle of the Depression, and there was not much money going around, and working for 75 cents a day or $1 a day was okay with us, and we were glad to have the opportunity to do so. It was a great part of our childhood in Daphne was to anticipate a Jubilee and to try to find where it is. Now they're a little bit evasive because they will be in one place and not another, or a mile away or so forth, so you have to really be on the alert. When the Jubilee cry would go out, Jubilee, when the early days, the people would respond, and we would be prepared. We'd have our Jubilee tubs and our lights and our gigs and our scoop nets, and we would go down and try to find them. The first Jubilee I was ever on was really late in the morning for a Jubilee to be still on, and it was up in the northern part of Daphne, and there was some trees near the beach that were casting the shadows, and so the flounders did not run away. But I looked down and it looked like the shape of a flounder, and I gigged it, and boy, the bottom exploded. Man, it was a great big flounder, and it just threw water and mud all over him. But we weren't prepared very well, and so we would catch the flounder and run up on the beach and put it behind a log so it wouldn't flip back. But that was the first one I was on, but the best one I was ever on was down on Raggedy Point, and it came in early in the evening, and there were just people all around, and there's a large bar that covers that area, and you can wade over 100 yards out probably up to your knees. And man, there was fish and crabs all over the place. But the most fun one we ever had was at the Foster's, and we had spent the night on the Foster's Wharf, and we had clocks set, but anyway, we slept through it, and Mr. Foster came down when he was getting ready to go to work, and there was a Jubilee on, and so he woke us up and kidded us about sleeping through a Jubilee, which we were doing. But anyway, this friend of mine was scooping them up, doop, doop, like that. He was picking those great big blue crab males, and I had a scoop net, and I was just running down through them, and I was picking them up just as they came. And I looked at him, and I picked my net up, and I turned it upside down and put them all back. And then I went to scooping the big one, because you could do that. But it was grand. We just spent a lot of time at the Bay and a lot of time at Foster's. And my mother would send me crabbing, which was a real pleasure. Anyway, we would go to bring crabs home to cook for a meal. Well, we'd goof off and play, and then by the time it was time to go home, we'd take scoop nets and go through the grass beds and run the crabs out of the grass beds, and man, 15, 20 minutes, we'd have 2 or 3 dozen crabs. I never told my mother what I was doing, but it didn't really matter. But it was great fun. The Bay was very important to us in regard to recreation. We spent almost I guess during the summer months, about every day or so, we were down at the bay doing something, fishing, swimming, what have you. Daphne was originally a bayfront community served by the bay boats, and a lot of the people commuted by bay boat daily from Daphne to Mobile. We had a very prominent Judge Joel Goldsby, who was very prominent in Mobile and very prominent person. And he was one of the residents in Daphne. And then we had Dr. Reginald Van Nijterstein, who was really a Canadian, and he went to medical school. I don't know how he got down here in Baldwin County, but he married Elodie Hall when she was about 19 years old, and then they went up to Chicago and finished his internship, and he came back, and he was a local doctor in my period of time, and he was such a fine, outstanding person. As a doctor, he was the best we had, and but he was very accommodating. He would make house calls, and I'm sure that he would take whatever you had for a payment, if it was a pig or chickens or a cow or whatever. But and it was those cases. But he was one of the fine people. Also, there was the Hammett was his name, and he was married to a Stapleton. The Stapletons were a very, very prominent family, and owned vast acres of Baldwin County. And they were in Baldwin County many, many years. And they were nice, accommodating people as well. And then, of course, we had a man, Hans Peter Hansen, who actually lived down in Shellbanks, but he became a Baptist minister, and he would sail his boat up to Daphne at least once a month to have a service up here in the earliest. That would have been in the 1890s and so forth. But that became a very prominent family around, and one of my lifelong friends was a Hansen, and they were mostly people who followed the sea, fishermen or what have you. But we also had a family, Yules, who ran a bakery in Mobile several generations, and they bought property in Daphne in the 1850s, and they commuted daily to Mobile by bay boat and ran this bakery. Later, there was, when Daphne moved upon the hill, we had a man named Stimson who was postmaster, and he was most accommodating. He represented the federal government to the cities of Daphne, and he would give you a letter of recommendation or tell you how to file for Social Security or whatever. But he was a most interesting and accommodating gentleman too. And of course, I mentioned the Trowns earlier, and they were accommodating in the same period of time in running the grocery store business. Of course, there was the Bertnolles that ran a store, and they had a delivery service, and they were very successful merchant. And the building right up the street, which has just been renovated, was the first Bertnolles store. And the second Bertnolles store is that large brick building at the corner of Van Avenue. And speaking of Van Avenue, there was a man, was Vanetti, and he moved to Daphne, and he was a retired individual that loved to speak to anybody, and he could talk on any subject that came up. And he was most renowned for his ability, and he had about 20 acres up on the street that we call Van Avenue, but the proper name is Vanetti. And of course, we had the Dolew family, and the Dolews were some of the earliest people in Daphne. I think it was about 1804 when they moved to Daphne permanently. That was Louis Dolew. His father, Dominic Dolew, got a land grant in Daphne, which is partly now Village Point Foundation and the Village Bayfront Park. And Dolews were very, very prominent and owned lots of land. And they were people like sheriffs and so forth, and merchants. So we had some early days of prominent people who developed a community, and sadly, Daphne had its ups and downs. First, it was the county seat from 1854 to 1901, thereabout, when the courthouse was moved to Daphne. So we lost the courthouse, and then we gained a college. And that ran from about 1911 to 1940, and then it closed. So those were setbacks. But Daphne really began to change at World War II. When the shipyards and Brooklyn Field opened up, they were in need of just huge labor forces. And they were moving into the area and living in anything that they could live in. And literally tents, vacated chicken houses. And at that time, the courthouse was vacant. And the families were moving into one room of the courthouse. And so Daphne really began to grow at that point and has been growing ever since. This church is the second oldest church in Baldwin County in 1854 and has been used almost continuously from that period. In the 70s, it was given to the group for a thrift store, and then it came under contract with the city of Daphne for a museum. And it is presently the Museum of Daphne and houses a great deal of items that belong with Daphne's history. We have courthouse records for the period of time from 1854 to about 1901, that when the courthouse was in Daphne. And we have a history of May Day and history of the various communities, the servicemen, our heroes, Indian pottery, items from the Civil War, a shotgun that could have been used when they came to steal the courthouse from Bayonette, and a great deal of pictures and books. And from time to time we have different displays. Right now we have one on early businesses in Daphne, and we're anticipating changing that to a new display so that we'd have the same old stuff. So you have to have something new and different to get the people to keep coming back. The items that we have here that are really family oriented is the Harrison spinning wheel and a picture of Lady Grandmother Harrison spinning, and also they have records of the letters exchanged in the Civil War, which we have on copy. And the organ over here is not the original organ, but the stool is. and the lady, Dr. Sims' daughter, was the organist, and she married Ossie Sermon. The other items in the left rear, like there's a lifeboat oar, which is very long, and have a maypole, an example of the maypole, which was the May Day celebration always had to have a maypole. The pulpit there is the original in the church, and the backdrop is unchanged. And the pews are original, and the chandelier is original. And it was elevated, of course, to come up and down, but a man named Julius Brady, in the early years of electricity, rewired that to be an electric light, and it is electric, but that's the only change, that it's been converted to electricity, and it is one of the original items. The balcony was considered a slave balcony when the families took their slaves with them to church, and that's where they sat up there. And the main door was facing the bay, but we closed that, and it's totally, we used the side entrance for that. Oh, also something very significant is in the Civil War, their records indicate that up to 27 Union soldiers, sailors, what have you, were buried in the churchyard. But there is no marking, and we do have names of at least 6 or 8 that we could trace, and we were thinking to maybe look for a grant or to get some research and get a monument for that particular incident. Our graveyard is older than the church itself. The earliest grave in there is 1847. However, we don't really know the earliest burial, and there are many burials out there that were without names. But this property was originally Captain Billy Howard, who built the Howard Hotel, and he bought the land in 1833, and it was the finest hotel in the South at the time. And he gave this land where the church and the cemetery is, and he himself is buried out here in an above ground crypt. His wife did not want to be buried in the ground, so that is, but we have some very prominent people back out there. The Judge Gaskey, the first judge that came to Daphne with the courthouse, is buried out there. And we have a Monarch, I don't know the proper pronunciation of the name, but his daddy was the first Indian to graduate from West Point, and he was a sheriff in Baldwin County. And he was killed in a skirmish, and he's out there. We have the first mayor of Daphne is buried out there, and we have 2 others that were mayors buried out there. There is a family plot in the back that is for the Potters. The McAdams and O'Neill were potters in Daphne, and they have done some clay posts and marked in their cemetery plot, and clay headstones from later dates, but that's prominent. And we have a man named Nelson who was killed in an accident involving the first of aircraft carrier. This is Alfred Guarisco, and I would like to thank the county for its effort to preserve the history of Baldwin County, which is so very rich and deep. And also, this is the eve of Alabama's 200th anniversary, and they are engaged in historic markers around the county of various events and features, and I think that that's very great. And again, I think it's a great project, and I would like to deeply thank the county for its effort here.